Writing and Methodology in Social Science, organized by JAIR, Jadavpur University, and the School of International Relations and Strategic Studies. The topic for today's lecture is Going Beyond the Basics, Mixed Methods, Research and Ethics. Our esteemed speaker for today is Dr. Sulagna Maitra. Dr. Maitra is a lecturer, assistant professor in Humanitarian Action, and coordinator of the International School on Addressing Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies at UCD Center for Humanitarian Action, School of Agriculture and Food Science. Prior to joining UCD, she worked as a researcher at the Global Change Program at Jadavpur University, India. Her main areas of interest are addressing gender-based violence, education, and professionalization of humanitarian action, the role of identity in conflict resolution, grassroots level reconciliation, the ethics of humanitarian mediation and negotiation, political dimensions of localization in humanitarian action, and transboundary river water conflict resolution. With this, I would like to invite ma'am to please commence the workshop. Welcome, ma'am. I welcome you on behalf of the University, JIR, and the School of IR.
Thank you so much, Anisha. Can everybody hear me properly?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Okay. So first of all, I'm delighted to be here. My association with JAIR actually goes back to its initial days. I think when Imanda was kind of trying to find it, and we established the JAIR, and we were all students at in Jadavpur University IR department. And we are, at least me, I'm eternally grateful to Imanda and SC Sir and everybody in the Department of International Relations for giving us that platform, because at that time, having such platforms for graduate researchers, who are doing their master's or their MPhil or PhD was very rare, because everything was kind of, you had to be at a certain level of seniority in order to publish or present papers and stuff. So JIR provided that platform, and in that sense, JIR has always been at and JU, the School of Strategic Studies and the department has always done a lot to encourage young scholars and to make sure that they are skilled and trained at the international level. And, so I remember SC Sir giving me the opportunity to kind of write with him and publish with him. Imanda giving us these amazing opportunities to write proposals and, kind of have these conferences. And now I can see that this program, so this is my second year lecturing on the program. I always enjoy discussing the topics and the issues that you have around research. My area of work since doing international relations has been more in humanitarian action. So it might be a little bit different. The issues are a little bit different that I work on, but I hope that you can relate and I hope that you find something useful. Now, because this is a 1 hour lecture, I won't have the time to get to know you all individually, but I hope that I get to know you all through the work that you're doing and the questions that you have. So I would invite you all to write your questions, and you don't always have to speak up if you are not comfortable doing that. So what I'm going to do is, if you will permit me, I'll put in the chat a Jamboard link where you can type your questions anytime you want. During the lecture, after the lecture, when we are having discussions. So I'll have a look at them at the end, and also feel free to type something in the chat. And of course, at the end of the lecture, we'll have time for question and answers, and I'll go through them. Okay. If I'm going too fast, or if there is something you need clarification on, please don't hesitate to just unmute. And just ask the question, or if you're writing it in the chat, then I would request the JAIR tech team to actually please keep an eye on the chat, and if you could let me know, I'll stop and I'll be happy to answer those questions. Okay, So the ground rule for this class, as I like to establish, is to please be comfortable in sharing your thoughts and sharing your questions, and I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. And if I can't, then I'll go back, research, and come back to you. So I don't promise to have all the answers, but I promise you this, that I'll do my best to answer the questions, okay? Also, I want to thank the JIR, JU Tech, the team here for making me sound way cooler than I am. I'm just a lecturer who just has some questions, and I go around trying to find some answers. And we have some awesome students studying with us and who actually do most of the work. And that's how we learn. That's how they learn. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. And yeah, so without any delay, I am going to start up. So if you look in the chat, you can actually see the link. And if you click on that link, I can see a number of you are already there. So let me just share. Let me just see if I can share here. So here is the Jamboard. I see already a few of you are here. So all you need to do is click on this sticky note thing, and something like this will come up. And you can write the question, say, who am I? And save it, and then go cancel, and it'll come up here, okay? So by the end of it, I hope that we'll have a lot of other, you can choose the question, you can play around with this. Okay, this way we can collect the questions during the sessions, and then we can go straight to answers at the end of the session, okay? Is everybody okay with that? Yes, no, don't care, please go away.
Yes, ma'am.
What is the answer?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Okay, great. So I'm going to stop presenting here, and then I'm going to try and do something and see if it works. Here, okay, let me start with the PowerPoint presentation. So how do I do that? Window. Okay. So today we are now. I looked at where you were, in this process or in this course, and I saw that you were about to start the methods. And I'm probably, if I'm not wrong, I'm the first lecturer you're meeting in order to kind of discuss the methods part, and you've done kind of the other stuff, getting a basic orientation about the research. So just so that I can situate myself, and contextualize where I'm coming from, I wanted to give you some, so I don't have a huge slide PowerPoint presentation, but what I hope to give you in this lecture are some tools that you can use in your research, and hopefully that will make sense to you. So, but before that, in terms of just contextualizing my lecture, I want to say what is humanitarian action, okay? Now, humanitarian action, simply put, is known as saving lives, alleviating suffering, and helping people live with dignity. And this just means that it emerged. Now, humanitarian, nobody has a monopoly on humanitarian action. We all do humanitarian action. If there is a flood, if there is, God forbid, if there is an earthquake, etc., the first responders are usually, the local people who want to help their fellow human beings. So that is the humanitarianism. But when we talk of humanitarian action per se, we are talking mostly about an international system, which is like this, you can imagine it in kind of some of these Hollywood disaster movies, like 911 kind of calls, where when there is an emergency, there is a set of agencies and the UN who are ready to jump in, save lives, alleviate suffering, and then go away. And they don't want anything to do with the politics, with the conflicts and the local dynamics of it. So that's how humanitarianism started. Whether it has been able to do that or not is another question. That's for another day. But that's the idea. So humanitarian action actually comes from the idea of rescuing fellow human beings who, who find themselves in difficulty. And you can juxtapose this with something like development or peace, which is about positive change. Yeah. So peace building, development, they are inherently political because they are about positive change. And when you talk about change, you're talking about kind of what is the value of change, what kind of values you want to put in place, etc., etc. Whereas humanitarian action is talking about providing relief, so the basic life-saving support and basic life-saving protection, which means and includes living with dignity. Now, this means that the research in humanitarian action is also governed with that. So very often, when we are talking about research in humanitarian action, and actually increasingly in IR also, when people are doing research, you'll find yourself researching developing context, changing context, volatile context, right? So humanitarian action is also, I mean, the most basic research in humanitarian action is around needs assessment. So what are the needs of the community that is affected by a disaster? And you can understand that in those circumstances, there are some special considerations that you won't have access to data all the time. You won't have ready access to technology. You might not have access to electricity even. You might have a very short window to determine the level of need, and then you have to kind of determine a response. So everything here in humanitarian action traditionally is about, especially on the needs assessment emergency side, is about kind of that kind of assessing needs under very trying circumstances. And that would govern its methods used, the size of the research, the level of generalizability, etc., etc. Yeah. So we're talking about very typical circumstances. Now, imagine on the other side of the spectrum, you do have elements like policy research or developing early warning system or kind of looking at developing new frameworks or innovations for building resilience, which are more long-term, which are more transformative. And there you have the luxury, I would say, of very kind of, of a wider choice of methods, interviewing wider stakeholders. And there you kind of have the opportunity to go into more qualitative methods as well. Okay. Why am I saying this to you? The reason why I'm saying this to you is that for your own topics, this is something you need to take into account when you are determining your research methods and your research design. Okay, that what are your circumstances, number one, and what do you have the money to do the research? Is it funded? What are the objectives of the donors and all these kind of things? But also, what are the circumstances of which you are what are the circumstances under which you're going to do the research? And most importantly, because this lecture is about ethics and we emphasize that a lot in our research, is that what is the impact that your research is going to have on the people who are your so-called subjects. Okay, and you will see this, that when you are interpreting, when you are doing research, for example, a lot of research goes on in Jadavpur about gender. It could be with sex workers, it could be with people living in very marginalized communities, it could be with tribals, it could be with any kind of marginal or vulnerable populations, or it could be in a very, very volatile situation. When you are, say, if under strategic studies, you're trying to kind of research in northeast of India, or, any of the conflict situations internationally, if you're investigating the migrant situation, etc. Now, in those cases, a huge tendency, or a normal tendency, is that, okay, I'm just going to go and interview the people who are going to be who are affected by this. So I want to go and talk to the people who have experienced for example, now in Hawaii, we have people, everybody going to go and wanting to interview the locals who have suffered huge losses in terms of life and livelihood. But is that really necessary? That is the question that you need to ask yourself. That is that really something that will help them? Why in social science research, this is something SC sir, I don't know if you guys know Shivashi sir or not, but one of the things that he told me during my PhD research, and he was my co-supervisor, and I remember very vividly, is that in social sciences, a lot of the time the research is going, the answers that you get or that you're looking for is going to be quite intuitive. So it's not like you're creating a chemical or you're discovering a new element or something like that. But the way you do the research, the systematic way you do the research, the objectivity, that the level of objectivity that you bring into it, the purpose, the overall goal of the research, and how you document that research, that is what is going to determine whether it is knowledge or not. Okay. And this is why methodology and all these sort of intangible considerations for methodology, which seem like these fluffy stuff, and oh, okay, yeah, I just want to get my stuff done and my thesis finished, or my MPhil dissertation finished and all, or my undergrad paper done. These seem like kind of not so important because you're running towards a target. But these are actually very, very important, and they will distinguish you from a regular run-of-the-mill person who's just doing a report to finish it, versus somebody who the professors and who fellow academics and peers will be like, okay, that's a serious researcher. Okay. And you will know the most important thing is your in research is your integrity, because unlike any other project management or any other thing, the most important thing about a research project is, or a research paper, is that you are driving it. How good it is, there's nobody telling you, okay, this is the question, this is the answer. A research is a project that you design yourself, you determine the question, you determine the methodology. So you are the project manager for this. And there'll be so many people to help you, but then you are the main person and you drive the work. It's not, the work doesn't drive you. So your morality, your ethics, and your consideration of how your research is going to impact the people who you are going to approach is going to be very, very important. And again, why am I again bringing this in? Is because this will tell us whether you need to do primary research or whether you can rely on secondary analysis. Okay, secondary document analysis, archival research, and everything. And I hope that I think the next session is with PPB sir, when he's going to do qualitative research, and I hope he'll cover content analysis and all these other things. You'll discover that there are so many ways in which qualitative research can actually help and lead to reinterpretation of policies. And that can be so, so valuable. So for example, one of our students, in gender-based violence, she wanted to do research on the UN documents and some of the other documents on gender-based violence, and on preventing and addressing gender-based violence. And actually, through just by reading these policy documents and doing qualitative content analysis of these policy documents, she proved that how this was actually creating a huge barrier for the LGBT community, or so say for example, when a trans person or a non-binary person kind of goes into a refugee camp, and this really happened. So this is an example from class. So one of our students who was working with a UNHCR in a UNHCR camp, and there was this trans person, so male to female, presenting as female. They wanted refuge and shelter, and at that point they didn't know how to help them except to refer them to another place, because this person presenting as female didn't wanted to be in the female the place where the female members were there, and they didn't want them because, they were perceived as not being female enough. And then the person didn't feel safe, in the men's camps. So the result, the way in which the policy had been written had meant that in its implementation, trans, and even now actually, these kind of the soji population, etc., they are not considered in a lot in humanitarian or gender-based violence responses. So it's quite ad hoc. So just by reinterpreting a policy that exists, so her whole research was actually sitting at a desk and just looking at policy papers, and yet she came up with something so fundamental that it is now informing the discussion in gender-based violence, and more organizations are taking it up. Similarly, there was another of our students who did work on resilience, and Trokra, which is one of the major NGOs. They actually revised their entire resilience policy based on the research done by this master's student. So the way you do the research, how you formulate your research, the ethics of that you follow in terms of the research really informs the quality of your research. And so even though you might be writing an undergrad paper or a postgrad paper, or even just doing like a small piece of work, it can have a huge impact. But it all determines on the on kind of the process that you undertake. Okay, so this is kind of the broad context, and in this, I don't want to go on about it too much because I'm conscious of the time. I now want to, first of all, I'm going to stop for a minute and see if you guys have any questions or any kind of curiosities at this point, and then I'm going to go into the more practical stuff of okay, how do you actually write the methodology section of your thesis or proposal, etc. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and see how that goes. Okay, so let me see if there is anything on the Jamboard. No, nothing yet. So tell me, how are you feeling so far about the questions and about the about what has been discussed so far? Do you have any observations? Even any interaction will be good, because otherwise it looks like I'm talking to a bunch of black boxes and it's not very nice. Okay, Orko Mukherjee.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
Ma'am, I have just one query. Like you were talking about ethics while we are doing our research and making a proposal. So while
Sure.
we are doing, like, ma'am, somewhere our biasness also creeps in, right? Like, how can we prevent that? So what's the alternative you can
Excellent.
suggest?
Excellent. So I can either take more questions or I can answer it as I go along, as I receive the questions. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? No? Okay. So I'll start with this and then we'll see where we go. That is a very good question, Argo, because now there are different schools of thought on this. Okay. Now, one school of thought will say, which is a more positivist kind of thing, is that and this happened in the 60s and then it was kind of refuted, so it's not in vogue right now. But one was that you kind of you basically focus on what is observable and provable. Okay, if that is even a word. And that was that, okay, if I'm observing a behavior, and this is kind of the main cornerstone of the behavioralist movement, is that in order for social science research or research in politics to be objective, what they said was that, yeah, we are just going to observe behavior. So there you would have like analyzing something like election patterns or voting patterns, consumer patterns, what are people buying, everything. You can look at needs of people, so in humanitarian research, you can kind of see, okay, what are if they come and they attend so, if you did a training, and this is a classic example that I like giving, is that, say, around participation, when you're measuring participation, yeah? and you say, okay, we did this training, so and so people participated, and that is, and if we have 100 people who have signed up, that means 100 people have been trained in this aspect. Okay, so that is because you're observing something, and you can say, well, I'm not biased because, you know, it's fact, you can see it. So that is one way. Yeah. But then this brings the question of, in social sciences, like, especially because you're dealing with humans, things are not always as they seem, right? So this is, so then came the counter criticism that, you know, people could be participating, as in people could sign their names and then sleep in the workshop and not be trained at all. So we actually need to know the motivation. Then, for example, in economics, there was this, you know, the products that are known as given goods. So products, technically, the demand for something is supposed to fall when the price rises. But for something like potatoes during the Irish famine, the more the price rose, the more the demand went up because people were spending everything they had on their staple. Yeah. So, so behavior, observing behavior is not always objective. So that argument goes. The other side of the spectrum is this argument that, look, you can never be objective. So basically, you shouldn't try to be. And that is where the current thinking is at. So what you will, when you read research now, and when you look into kind of especially decolonial research and, you know, decolonial, or in Kolkata, what is probably more popular as subaltern studies, what you'll see more of is something called positionality. Okay, so these two buzzwords, and I'm not a big fan of buzzwords, but these two buzzwords you'll hear all the time. One is intersectionality and the other is positionality. So positionality is very important when it comes to your, you know, your research and maintaining that so-called quote unquote objectivity. Okay, what is positionality? Positionality is where you make your biases, and not necessarily your biases, what you kind of make it abundantly clear where you're coming from. Okay, so for example, when I'm doing this lecture, I'm saying that, look, I'm coming from humanitarian action. This is what humanitarian action means. These are the type of research that goes on in humanitarian action. And now I'm kind of going to go into, in the next part of the lecture, I'm going to go into methods and how you choose methods and all these kind of things. But what I tell you about that is kind of dependent on who I am and where I'm coming from, my background, right? So this is where you know that in what context you are listening, you're receiving this information. So you're not kind of, you know, you're being very transparent, I suppose is a way to look at it. Yeah. And this is something that almost, actually, some of the journals, they even demand that you mention your positionality. So if there is, if you're receiving funding from somebody, if you are kind of coming from, you know, a particular technical background, so like you have to mention whether you're a social scientist or a political scientist, etc. You have to mention if you have any relations with the stakeholders. So for example, community action research or action research, you have to say, like, we have a lot of students who are doing, say, resilience, who are working on resilience. So one of my PhD students just completed his PhD yesterday, and he is from the Wolaita community in Ethiopia, and he was researching within that community to build resilience for his community, you know. So that research is valid. That doesn't make his research invalid just because he must be biased because he's researching about his own community. No, it actually makes his research more valuable in the current environment because he knows what he's talking about. But people need to know that he has that understanding so that they are able to challenge them, okay? Or they are able to make other people, like they are able to maybe ask certain tough questions, to certain critical questions, to make sure that he has, you know, considered all possibilities. Okay, does that answer your question, Logro? Okay, so I have another one from Tito saying, does an unethical research, sorry, the question disappeared. Does an unethical research affect only the subjects of that research, or does it affect the outcome of the research too? I would say it affects the outcome of the research too. But you have used a very interesting term, and that is unethical research. Okay. So we have talked a bit about ethical research, but what is unethical research? Because one of the things that you will find in social science research is the use of deception. Okay. So here I'll give you another example. So, when if you do a survey of what programs everybody watches, yeah, you can do it in your class also. And you will find that people will say, oh, I watch BBC, I watch sports, my favorite team is this and that. And they could be watching Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahuti. Sorry, I'm old, so I refer to Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahuti, but maybe it's whatever soap is. Ekta Kapoor soap is the all the rage right now in India. Yeah. So similarly, it happened in a research in Haryana that they were basically researching about attitudes of people from a certain community towards female child, girl child. And everybody said, I'm sorry, I'm just going to use a bit of Hindi here. And they just said, "Arey nahi, ye to ghar ki Lakshmi hai, ye hai, wo hai, falana dhimkana." Yeah. But when you look at female infanticide, Haryana at that point in time, at least, the rates were some of the highest in the country. So why this dissonance? And this is so here in a situation like this, and similarly, if you want to research on drug use within a community, say on campus, yeah, or you want to research on how much and what kind of porn people consume, and those kind of things. So these habits, which actually inform society and inform us to help us to know our society better, there sometimes people are not truthful. Okay. So there you might have to use deception, as in research ethics determines or says that you should actually be upfront and you should tell people what your research is about, where it is going to be published, etc., etc. But sometimes you can't disclose that, because then it'll have directly an impact not only on the outcome, like you've asked in the question, but also on the kind of responses and on the subject and all these kind of stuff. Yeah. So there is a whole different set of ethics that applies. That, okay, what do you do when you have to be deceptive or have to use some kind of deception in research? Yeah. So yes, unethical research affects not only the subjects, because it can actually expose them to further danger, especially when you're dealing with something like gender-based violence, or it can also definitely impact the outcome. Because, for example, there have been numerous cases. So one of these things about vaccines lead to autism and all these kind of things, like you'll hear that a lot in the media about, especially during COVID. Actually, that study has been discredited because of some of the unethical practices. And there are several there are several these kind of examples that actually impact the outcome, because you've not done the sampling properly, because you've not considered all the all the stakeholders that should be involved, and that is definitely motivated by research, by actually bad ethics. So some of the research that is done by some of the pharmaceutical companies, or some of the politically motivated or socially motivated research, they can be pushing a certain agenda, and they will definitely determine the outcome. There's a very funny video on from a very old show called Yes Minister. If I have the time, I'll show it, and you'll see how actually the question determines the research. I have Jogosheni. I don't know if I'm saying the name correctly.
Yes, ma'am, Jagosheni.
Jagosheni. Sorry.
No,
So
no, ma'am.
go on,
Good
and then
evening.
I'll take Shantan's question.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Go
Good
on.
evening, ma'am. So,
Good
yes.
evening.
Ma'am, this is not exactly my question. So, this question came in one of my exams. So, it was like, do you think ethics is more important for qualitative research or quantitative research? So, ma'am, I didn't know the answer, so I want to ask you this question. Thank you.
I would say, I think it was unfair to ask you that question. But in any case, without getting into that kind of controversy, I would say ethics is important for research, full stop. Now, I suppose where the question came from is that in qualitative research, you might be usually you might be I would have answered the same, because you see, like if I say that qualitative research, it is more important for qualitative research, and that for a social scientist might be the default answer, because you're dealing with human subjects. There are more places of it. So when you look at ethics, yeah, you have to think about the fact that there are locations where ethical dilemmas apply. Yeah. And I would suggest, and it could be argued that in qualitative research, you have more number of locations where these ethical dilemmas will emerge. Okay. Whereas if you're doing quantitative research, in quantitative research, I suppose people would say, okay, once you have your sampling and your research kind of defined, you're just crunching numbers and you're kind of doing doing the analysis. But there, first of all, I'm thinking of research, quantitative research in biology, which is dealing with animal subjects, or anything dealing with non-human subjects. The other thing is that what kind of analytical tools and what kind of results you kind of come up with is also a question of ethics. So ethics in a narrow sense, if you mean that, okay, because traditionally for say research at undergrad level and all, ethics means, okay, sign the consent form and da 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 da, which is pretty procedural. I would say it's, but I would say that, okay, the tendency is more towards qualitative research. But when it comes to quantitative research, there can and there have been serious breaches of ethics in quantitative research. So my answer to that question would be ethics is important for the entire research process, full stop. Doesn't matter if it is qualitative or quantitative. However, dealing with human subjects, directly, there are very serious consequences. There can be very immediate consequences, and there are more locations probably of ethical dilemmas in qualitative research, where ethics might count. But yeah, I think that's how I would answer the question. I do, does that help? I don't know.
Yes, yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay. So, okay, I'm going to go to Shantan's question and then go to Shuvecha's question, and then I'm going to go into the next part of the lecture. Okay. So, what about covert research? And justify the means of being covert researcher. What are the ethical considerations for? That's a very good. That's a very good question, actually. Ends justify the means? No, ends definitely don't justify the means in research. So there are a set of protocols. First of all, you have to be. So one of the things, one of the major aspects of ethics in research is accountability. So who you are accountable to, how you are expressing that accountability, and usually, just as in any kind of, any kind of anything really, you have is that usually ethics is or usually accountability is all upward accountability, as in everybody is saying, answering to their boss and not to the people who are quote unquote below them. So usually you have a lot of researchers being accountable to their donors, so whether it's the UGC or a philanthropic organization or anything, but they're not being so accountable to the people who are, who they are researching with, who are their subjects, their teammates, etc., etc. Yeah. So in terms of, like, I could do a whole section on what are the ethics of covert research, but that should be like another, and I think you'll probably cover it a bit in qualitative research. But there is a very good handbook, SAGE handbook for social research methods, which actually deals with this and how do you deal with deception, covert research. Now, covert research could mean that, you are not telling, there are levels of covert research, yeah? So it could mean that you're not dealing with, like, you're not telling them upfront, but once the research is done, then you submit, you kind of make the results known, you tell people, and that way you're accountable. And the other thing is that you ask people's permission before you kind of publish that research, or else you anonymize it to the extent that it cannot be traced back to the person. So it's all about protecting the people and not harming. So remember the basic rule that do no harm, which is kind of the basic rule for everything, is that you should always, always consider the harm that might be caused. And if you look at, say, for example, the ethics forms that we fill out in UCD, even for master's research or undergrad research or, like funded academic research, there is nothing called exemption form anymore, or, no risk forms, because it's considered that every research can have potential risks. So how it is defined is low risk and high risk. Okay. So low risk means that, there is a very remote chance of, it's like, in the medicine bottle, when they list the side effects, like there is a very remote chance that, something might happen to you. My chair is squeaking. But, but it is still a possibility, because 1 out of 1 million people had that symptom. And then a high risk one is that, no, there is a more than 50% this thing. Okay. So Shantan, does that answer your question, that covert research will have its own set of ethics? And, they are, but the main principle to follow there would be, a guiding principle to follow there would be accountability and do no harm. And, that often comes down to common sense, actually,
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, perfect. So now,
And ma'am,
Shuvecha,
can you share the book which you told about?
so they are literally, so one of my colleagues just informed me yesterday, because he's writing a chapter for it, that they're literally going to come out of they're going to have a new edition to it. But what I can do is, after the lecture, I can actually maybe send you some material, some articles or some chapters from there, which might be helpful, if that's,
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
if you guys are interested. Okay, so I'm just going to make a note of it. Okay, so now I'm supposed to finish in a few minutes. So Shuvecha, just go on, please.
Ma'am, as you talked about someone who's researching about his own community, what if
Yes.
a researcher belongs to a community, it belongs to a privileged community, and he or she is researching on an unprivileged community? Then the question of positionality, I think, will have negative effect. I mean, may have negative effect. Like if I am a cis woman and researching on some issues of women as a whole, and I will draw something from trans women, then how will I ensure that I am being authentic, or how will I ensure that it is safe?
Excellent question. So this is something that happens actually, and you've mentioned it in a gender case, and I completely get it. And it's a very topical issue right now, because of what's happening around the world, mainly in the West. And just to actually build on that, one of the things that happens is that now, when in gender-based violence, some of us started doing research on the SOGI population within gender-based violence and whether they should be considered or not in the humanitarian, whether they should be part of the gender-based violence cluster or whether they should be a new cluster and all these things. A common kind of criticism that was leveled was that, oh no, this discussion is only happening in the West. People in Africa and Asia, they're not really considered, they're not really bothered about LGBTQ or trans issues or whatever. This is like just a Western conversation. And there people are worried about, hunger and violence and all these things, as if you cannot be hungry and trans at the same time, So yes, I mean, you can, not only can you be wrong, you can also be wronged when you're trying to do the right thing as well. Okay. So that's one of the issues. The other thing is that in humanitarian research, this kind of white guilt is something that comes up quite a lot. That, now traditionally, a lot of the research, and actually all the research, was informed by or was done by the donors or the donor-sponsored think tanks. So if you look at the humanitarian donor system, it's still state-based, and you have UK and USA and the EU kind of having the majority of the funding. And so if you look at the mainstream literature, you'll see think tanks like the ODI and the Feinstein International Institute and all these things. And certain scholars and certain think tanks come up again and again, and Human Rights Watch, they'll come up again and again and again, and they have perpetuated a certain narrative, which is with the best intention. So I'm not saying like they're deliberately, like they're evil people colluding to kind of perpetuate something, but they were coming from a certain positionality that informed their study. And so now you actually have an alternative kind of narrative emerging, and which is only after, like the Black Lives Matter, and also because subaltern studies and third world studies and all these kind of things, so the so-called marginal disciplines already existed. But now, since Black Lives Matter happened in the US, and suddenly everybody in Europe and America woke up to this whole thing, and critical race theory, they're like, oh my God, now we need to decolonize humanitarian action. So now everything is about decolonizing humanitarian action. And some of us are going, dude, that existed a long time ago. Like subaltern studies was kind of started in the 90s and the late 80s by scholars in India, so this is not new. But so yes, like there can be that power dynamics that you have, like that can genuinely impact research, and that can genuinely impact research in spite of the best intentions. Okay, and it can add to a certain narrative. But at the same time, the thing is that it doesn't prevent you from doing, like it shouldn't prevent you from doing this thing, research. Okay, so as a cis woman, it doesn't mean that you cannot do research on transgender issues, or if you're straight, you cannot do research on LGBT issues, or if you are white, you cannot do research on ethnic conflicts in Uganda. Again, it is all about, it comes back to these principles, and this is why it is so important to kind of know and abide by these principles of accountability, positionality, and do no harm. Okay, these are the things that I feel like you come back to again and again and again. So when you're doing your research, for example, as a cis woman looking into transgender issues, you kind of state that you state that in when you're doing a focus group interview, then you can, and you keep that. There is again, and it comes with certain skills that you have to learn as well. And one of them would be active listening. Okay, so active listening is that when you're not just shutting up, but you're actually listening to people, and you're thinking about it, you're processing it, you have an open mind. So it requires a bit of training, and you'll be surprised how much of a training it requires. Okay, so these principles of being accountable to the community, making sure that there is no harm, continuous and informed consent, you keep telling them, that, okay, this is what you are doing. So for example, going back to the question of covert research, yeah, and unethical research and all this kind of thing, as a cis woman going into a transgender community and kind of pretending to be somebody else and doing covert research, that I would say is probably not advisable, so this is something now. So there can be so many situations in social research where you really have to make that moral judgment for yourself or with your team, etc. So it's not really like something that I can give you a list that these are the do's and these are the don'ts, but it really comes back to your positionality, do no harm, and accountability. Yeah, and just kind of making sure that what you are doing is kind of ethically valid in terms of the process, and not that the ends justify the means. Okay, so I would end this question or answering this question in a one of these examples from Concern Worldwide. I think it was in Uganda. And so Concern Worldwide is a big NGO, is a big Irish NGO, and they wanted to intervene with the help of the community. And this was, say, an Irish woman going into a community, like a rural community, trying to change attitudes towards gender-based violence, domestic violence, yeah? And they wanted to work with the men and the women, but how do you do that? And how do you claim to know? Because a lot of the time what you can get is that, well, you don't know our culture, you don't know this is how families work, and if you try to change it, you're changing our family, da 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 da. So what they did was that they worked with the community, they worked with the local leaders, and instead of kind of going, oh, you shouldn't beat your wife, or you shouldn't do this, or whatever, like instead of having that, they did a more storytelling session. Okay, so what they did was they asked everybody in the community, man, woman, child, everybody, to write situations where they had felt that they had either been violated, they had experienced violation, or they felt threatened, or something like this. And everybody wrote it in a piece of, like, anonymous piece of paper, or they had somebody written. And then this is known as the clothesline method. So what they did was they took a rope, and then, just as you hang clothes, they kind of hung all these experiences, and they put it in the center of a room like this, like an S-shaped kind of thing. And then people from the community, they came and they read those experiences. So it wasn't about, this person harming this person or this person doing this person. And you see, in this way, they very clearly, they had actually, the concerned person, the NGO representative, hadn't really inserted themselves in the story. You see, they were just facilitating the process. They were not inserting themselves in the story. But when the community read that there was so much violence, there were so many situations where people felt threatened, the reaction came from the community themselves, and they were like, okay, this is wrong and we need to address it. And that has led to, actually, Uganda, you'll see, like, there are some excellent examples of men coming together to address things like toxic masculinity, and something which I believe is a very current topic in Kolkata right now. But all these kind of things, that these are, so you can actually design a research where if you feel that your positionality is going to be an issue, then you design your research in a way that you don't insert yourself into the narrative. And again, that requires training, that requires practice, that there are specific skills and techniques in action research that you can do. And you can look into that, if that is something that you feel like that you want to do. But there is a way to do that ethically. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am, it is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So now, as usual, I've mismanaged my time, but I think I want to leave you with this tool, and what I'll do is I'll send this to the team as well. So this is a book I like a lot. One is called The Craft of Research, and that is a very good book, but this is an Oxford University Press publication. and it is like how to do your social research project. And every chapter kind of comes with these tools, and they give you these templates on how to write, how to kind of do your literature review, how to plan your. So this one is about the methods and methodology. And you can see that this table, I thought when I was going through it, I thought it would be a very good way, a very simple way for you to design your project and actually keep track of how much progress you're making. Okay, so here you can see that how, even though the chapter is methodology, and I'm just going to go through it very quickly, you can see that how the, even though it is a question of methodology, you actually have to start by thinking about what are the aims and the objectives, and what is the kind of the research, what is the type of research question, or what is your research question. Because your research question, and eventually if you want to do the theoretical approach or your conceptual framework, like that is going to determine whether you are going to have a qualitative methodology, a quantitative methodology, or a mixed methods approach. Okay, so usually, like, we say that a good research question, which is a more probing question, is actually something that is a why or a how question. Okay, because that kind of leads you to discovering more of what is happening behind. Whereas if you are asking what or where, then it is very straightforward, and it leads to more kind of descriptive answers. And it can often lead to, you can often probably address it with quantitative answers. So if I say, okay, what is the population of India? It's something you can calculate, something you can observe, something you can do, But if I say, why is the population of India so and so, then you have to go into all these, different kind of aspects. Or how can we address the rapid increase of India's population, or the population growth rate? Then again, you have to go into more qualitative kind of methods. Okay. The other thing that you have to notice in a research question is the so what. So usually in applied research, the so what determines the impact. Yeah, and again, that will have an impact on the ethics, the methodology, and what kind of things that you ask. So the so what is as in, okay, if you go and say, yeah, I want to know about the population of India, or I want to know why is the population of India so and so. But then what are you going to do with that knowledge? Okay, and again, it comes back to the ethics, as in, just because you want to do this research and you have a degree from a certain university, doesn't mean that you let yourself, you unleash yourself on a poor community and just start asking questions. That's height of privilege. That's wrong. Okay, so you have to always know, even if it is that not part of your formal research question, that that it is why are you doing this research? And usually it means who is going, very practically, it means who is going to read your research, or who is it going to be useful to? Is it the policymaker? Is it the community itself? Is it an NGO? Is it a student? Who is it going to be useful for? Okay. And then that will give you an idea of the theoretical orientation, or the theoretical approach that it says here. Okay, what is the theoretical approach? Now again, this we will not go into too much depth for this, but it can be, just think of it this way, that you can do a research at a systemic level. So you can use something like systems theory, or input output model, or something like that, where you look at it, okay, this is the state, this is what's happening, this is what they did. Or you can look at it more at a social, at a kind of constructivist level, where you're looking at interactions, you're looking at, okay, how one person talking to another kind of made a difference in the decision. So for example, if you're analyzing a foreign policy that, okay, India went to war with Pakistan, or India and Bangladesh have a water issue, you can either look into the ministries, the summits that were there, the meetings that were had, and all these kind of things. Or you could go into, okay, what were the politicians doing? What were the personality of the politicians? Who said what? What were the type of articles that were being written? What kind of pressure did the different interest groups exert? And all these kind of different kind of things, you know, which will actually give you a more nuanced understanding. So even though your question might be why does India and Bangladesh have a water conflict problem, you can the methodology can actually, your theoretical approach to methodology can actually determine what kind of answers you will get. Okay. The other thing is then you come to the methods and some of the so it's very common to say that methods, you know, you need to be, what is it called, smart. You know, like it has to be I have to think of the thing now. Anyway, but in terms of methods, what specific quantitative methods and qualitative methods? Now, usually a lot of the research that is being done now, it can be mixed methods, but depending on the kind of tradition, the particular subject area that you go into, and the continent, believe it or not, on which you are doing your research will actually determine what kind of methods you choose. So for example, if you are working at an American university, they have a very quantitative kind of tilt. So even for IR, they make you do like statistics and game theory and all these different kind of things. So there is a lot of modeling, speculation, and, you know, that kind of you know, like predicting behavior is very much the tradition there. So and again, in gender-based violence, it's very, very interesting because all the research that is coming out of, say, the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and everything, they are all using advanced statistics to actually measure the impact of interventions in gender-based violence, you know, cash transfers in gender-based violence. I think that was the latest one we read with Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And whereas we have, you know, in Europe and in the UK, and now after Brexit, we have to say Europe and the UK, you have to be like, you know, it is much more qualitative when it comes to political science and international relations research. Not to say that there is no quantitative study, but the tradition is more so. Even in gender-based violence, like one of our professors, she is, you know, I think one of the top people in gender-based violence. Like she was literally on a list, and her idea is to go and talk to people and, you know, kind of find out the impact. So if people have had a positive impact, she would actually know by talking to the stakeholders who were involved. So method, and again, qualitative, quantitative, like pick up any book, and this is why I didn't go into like the list of what are the positives and the negatives, but every method has its advantages and disadvantages. What you need to know is, again, you have to be very clear on what is the nature of your question, what is the nature of your answer that you're looking for. So are you looking for just top level kind of stuff, or are you interested in the interactions and everything? Also, another thing, methods is for data collection. And what people forget about, that once you collect the data, you have to analyze it. So don't collect data if you don't know what you're going to do with it. Okay, this is the most important advice that I can give you. So you have to frame your analysis before you collect your data. So you have to know that if I'm going to do an interview, and if I'm going to do 10 interviews and I get only 5 interviews in the end, what am I going to do with them? Because just saying, okay, on this question, this person said this person said this person said this, is not research, it's reporting. Okay, you have to know that, okay, this is the question, this is the answer that I'm looking for. If, you know, this is how I'm going to code the data, this is how I'm going to analyze the data. And you can, it doesn't matter if you want to do it with a pen or pencil, if you want to do it on Excel, if you want to, I am not going to take that call. If you want to, if you want to use programs like NVivo or MaxQDA, etc., do whatever you want, but know how you are going to analyze the data before you determine kind of what kind of methods and what kind of data you're collecting. Okay, sampling. The most important thing about sampling, and I'm going to finish in 2 minutes, I don't want to take more of your time. The sampling now, the most important, of course, you have probability sampling, non-probability sampling, and in non-probability sampling, you have purposive sampling. So if you're doing more qualitative studies, then you can go, more towards purposive sampling or snowball sampling. So these would be, where you ask for recommendations, you kind of know exactly who you're going to do, or you can go to a broad canvas. So like, again, one of the projects where you literally divide, you take a geographical area, with households, you map it on your, on Google Maps, and then you divide it, you make it into a grid, and you say, okay, I'm going to, in this grid, I'm going to question or survey every 5th household. Yeah, so you can do it like that as well. The important thing for sampling, there are 2 things. One is that you need to know the representativeness, and every time you go for a particular type of sampling, you need to know the best practices for that type of sampling. So what are the best practices for purposive sampling? What are the best practices for probability sampling, etc.? And the other thing that you should remember is that sampling is not just for humans, it is also for documents. So very often people give us, when they write their projects, especially when they're starting to write their thesis papers or their research papers, they'll give us a huge list of why they interviewed XYZ people and who they surveyed, etc. But when it comes to their documents, the reports, the meeting memos and all these things, or even journal articles, there is no sampling strategy. There's like literally no sampling strategy. Oh, I just Googled stuff and I found it. And then, no, when you Google stuff and you decide to exclude or include something, that's sampling as well. So when you're writing your research paper, you actually need to flag everything that you've done. And this is why it's so important when you're doing your research to have a notepad, or I don't know if you're fancy, have it on your phone or something, but literally write down every single decision, every single communication you've had. Doesn't matter if you're doing it over coffee or if you're writing at your desk, you should write down everything, because all that is actually part of your research methodology. Okay. Then access and location, yes, they are determinants. And again, access and location depends on your privilege, it depends on what kind of study you're doing, etc. But I would argue that, again, think about whether you need to go out and collect data as well, because often there is so much you can do with archival research, with secondary document analysis. It's really an underutilized and underappreciated area. And that is why, first of all, you keep the control. It is less resource intensive. And it can lead to excellent results, and we have seen that. So here we see, I think, ethics, reflexivity, positionality we've done, and organization of data and analysis. This is something that's more kind of qualitative. I think this will be covered more in the next lecture with qualitative. So I think that's my spiel, if that's okay. Does anybody have any questions? Go on. Deviates from, but I believe it's relevant to ask in that case particular. Should I ask? You can ask me here. Doesn't matter. Or you can email me. I can give you my email address. Anybody else have any questions? It's quite late. It's almost dinner time, no? 8 something, 8:30. Anybody else have any questions? About ethics in ethnographic research, I was reading Sandra Halperin's book on research methods, very good. It mentions a case in, I think, yeah, that's well, depends on what capacity they went. If they went in a position where they were supposed to influence, then maybe, but normally that would be a complete no-no. You see, this is also a very, now again, this is where one of these ethical dilemmas come in. One, I don't know if you've seen, there is this very famous picture from the Ethiopian famine, and actually that photographer ultimately committed, like took his own life, because there was this picture of a completely malnourished child, and sitting, and then there was a vulture sitting next to it, basically waiting for the baby to die so that it could eat it. And this photographer won the Pulitzer Prize for it and took the photograph. And then the criticism was that why didn't they try to save the child or whatever? I think they would have tried to, or they couldn't or something. And here the idea is that when you're doing research in when you're doing research in like extremely kind of volatile or dire situations, what is your role? Do you intervene, or do you just do your job and just kind of leave that kind of intervention with somebody else? And in that sense, the answer, there is no actually real yes or no answer. If you feel that you are empowered to do something, that your intervening would help the situation. So for example, if somebody is being harassed, or if somebody, then you can probably advocate for that person, or where it will make a difference. But sometimes it can actually harm the person. Sometimes you can think you're doing good, but you can actually end up harming the person. And one of the cases that we have is this thing of everything has to be women led. So in gender-based violence, women were put in the forefront of projects, they were given the money and all these kind of things, because the idea was that if you give it to the head of the household or the man of the household, then it might not go towards children's feeding and education, whereas if you give it to the woman, it would go towards the household. And that was the assumption. And in some sense, perhaps it was correct, though it may or may not be correct. But the other thing was,